Today we're going to make a travel size pillowcase, the Burrito style pillowcase. So that's when the cuff of the pillowcase looks like this. And the size that we're doing today is for a travel size pillow measuring 12 inches high by 16 inches wide. This video here is to show you how to do it using the least amount of fabric as possible to save money. It does require just an extra step, but time is money, so you can decide if you want to do it this way or the other way. This is just to conserve fabric. Normally, when you would do it the normal way to do a Burrito style pillowcase, you would be getting about 3/4 of a yard of fabric, but this way here that I'm going to show you, I only needed to get just under half of a yard of the fabric. The finished cut size for length here is going to be 13.5 inches. If you're purchasing fabric, I do a little bit more because when you wash it, it might shrink a little bit. So 13.5 inches this way. And then I already cut this, the width, I want that to be at 32 inches wide. The cuff of the fabric, I would order or buy about 1/4 of a yard, and then after you wash it, I would trim it down to 8 inches here. And then I went ahead already and I just cut this in half, so now I have 2 pieces measuring 8 inches by approximately 22 inches here. It doesn't matter the exact width, we're going to be trimming this down a little bit later. So the first step then is we're going to be doing kind of essentially 2 burritos. Have it if you have it that way. We'll be doing one on this side and one on this side, and then sewing them together again to conserve fabric. So to start out, we're going to take one of our cuff pieces of fabric and just lay that facing upwards on your workspace, and then take your main fabric, one of the shorter edges, and line that. If you have a nice 90-degree corner, you can line it up with your corner of your cuff, and then match those raw edges like that. Okay, now take the rest of your fabric here and we're going to roll it up like you would a burrito. This is how this style of pillowcase gets its name. We roll it up like a burrito until we get all the way to here, and then you can see as I did that, it shifted my fabric a little bit. I'm just going to realign that. So I have my folded fabric here, my raw edges in alignment. Now I'm going to take this edge of my cuff and I'm going to now match it up to the other raw edges and throw a few pins in there to keep it in place. And now we are ready to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew this raw edge just to where, like, you can stop right here. This excess stuff we're going to cut off after we sew it together and turn it right side out. So go ahead and sew using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance from here all the way to here, and then we'll return back. All right, so you can see I sewed that raw edge together. Before we turn this out, I always like to double check my work and peek in here, open those up, and just make sure that you got all 3 layers throughout your entire seam, because there's nothing worse than turning this through and realizing that a piece of it slipped in and you didn't catch it, and then you have to like rip out the seam and start all over again. So just double check that you got all 3 layers along the whole length of that seam. Next step then is to take your cuff layers and spread them apart, and then just kind of work your way through so that the body of the pillow here comes out of the burrito, and voila, you have your first cuff. It's just so neat how this works its way out, and it just looks like such a nice finished product there. All those raw edges are hidden. And now is what I want you to do is we're going to just make sure that the seams here are pushed outwards and that this is nice and straight out this way. Now we're going to trim this here to make sure that it's nice and straight. So what I do is I kind of line my raw edge here of the body of the fabric up with my cutting mat here, and then I take my ruler and I place it against that line to get it nice and straight, and then I just cut that nice and even with the rest of it. My ruler kind of slipped there. Let me fix that. Okay, so now we have that first edge done, and we're going to repeat now with this other side over here. Now with the normal way to do this, where you're using more fabric, this burrito step here, you just have one step and it'd be the whole length of it, and then this part here would be folded, and you'd then have your finished pillowcase. But again, we're conserving fabric, so here's the extra step that's required to save that fabric. And we're going to do the same thing. Since this is my selvage edge, I'm just going to flip that around so that'll be the end that I cut off, and I will use this to line up the corner this way. I do have a video available if you're using directional print for the cuff to help you decide or understand how you place that, how that's going to turn out, if it's right side up, facing the print, facing away from the print, or how you want that to happen. I will leave a link to that in the video or in the description of this video here. Right now I'm just rolling this section up like we did in that first step and make sure that's nice and aligned. Next we'll fold this over, right sides facing, and pin it together, and we will repeat and sew that just like we did before. I will speed up the camera here and we'll meet back once it's done. Okay, so now you can see that we have both of our cuff ends finished. We are going to be using a French seam when we work on this, but before we do sew it and finish that construction, I like to press my cuffs so that they lay nice and flat. So go ahead and grab a pressing mat or your ironing board, and all you're going to do then is kind of like what we did before we trimmed it, just make sure that it's stretched out that way. You can just kind of pinch that fold and pull, and then use your iron and just press that, the seam, and then also then the folded edge here, just so that it lays nice and flat. That way when we construct it, we know that we're nice and even on both sides. And you can repeat then for the other side of the pillowcase. Okay, so now we can start with the construction. And as I mentioned, we are going to be using a French seam. If you've never sewn a French seam before, please pay careful attention to how I'm placing my fabric. We are going to start with the wrong sides facing each other. I know that seems so backwards when it comes to sewing, but when you do a French seam, that's how we start the process. So we'll just start with this top edge. Line up your edges and the center seam here, or the cuff seam with each other so that they're nice and even, and pin along that top edge. And we will then go to the sewing machine here in a minute, and we're going to sew this top edge and this bottom edge together using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, so just under a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then what will happen is we'll then turn the pillowcase with right sides facing, and I'll show you what to do there with that seam. And then when we finish it, we're going to be finishing with just under a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And that's going to encase the raw edges completely, and it's going to make this pillowcase a whole lot more durable because you'll have no frayed edges or no raw edges anywhere shown on the pillowcase, because as you can see in here, there's no raw edges because they're tucked inside the cuff. And since we're doing a French seam on these edges here, it's going to hold up a whole lot longer for all those multiple washes needed. So now we'll sew this edge and this edge together using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so now we have both this top edge and the bottom edge sewn together with that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can see my fabric, it does fray a little bit, and when we have these strings and we do this next step, they'll peek through. So at this time, I like to just use my rotary cutter and just trim those off so I don't have to deal with them later. I'm not cutting the seam, I'm just cutting those little flyaway threads that have decided to peek out. And same for this side here. Okay, so now what you're going to do is you're going to turn this, normally I would say inside out, but since we're already, oh no, that will be right, inside out. See, again, French seam is kind of confusing because it's always backwards from what you normally would do. So now I'm pointing out my corners, and my right sides of the fabric are facing each other. And what you're going to do now is you're going to take this seam and you're going to kind of stretch it apart a little bit. Don't pull it too hard. You just want to get it nice and stretched out, and then you're going to fold it back on itself like this, and you're going to put a pin in there to keep it in place so that the seam is right on the edge of that fold. And if you look at it this way, you can see what happens. The raw edges are encased right here, and we're going to pin that against the whole length of the top and the bottom. This here, it's kind of a tedious step with the French seam, but man, is it worth it to get to that finished end result and not have any of the raw edges showing. It's just more of a quality professional look to it, but it does take some time and some practice and patience. So I will speed up the camera so you don't have to watch me do it, because it does take a little bit of time to do that. So we'll speed up that camera now. All right, so now you can see I have both edges pinned and ready to be sewn. Now you're going to do, I would say, just under a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The big thing is you want to make sure that we're sewing on this side, the left side, or away from those raw edges so that they're not going to peek through. But we don't want to be too small of a seam allowance, otherwise those raw edges will peek through, and then you have to go ahead and repeat it and make it a little bit steeper of a allowance. So I would say about a 1/2 inch. Truly the width of the pillowcase here, once you're done, should be about 12, I'd say about between 12 and 12.5 inches wide, depending on how snug you want this to fit on your pillow. And so go ahead and just measure where that 12.5 inches or maybe 12.25 inches are to know what your last here seam allowance needs to be to make it be that finished width. We'll go ahead and sew now. So now that we have those edges sewn with that about 1/2 inch or a little less seam allowance, we are finished. We're ready to turn this right side out, point our corners, and insert our favorite pillow. I do have other tutorials available. Please check the description for links for other sizes of these pillows. And please also don't forget to like and subscribe my channel. Thank you so much.